Welcome to part 2 of this 4-part series on how to play Chain of Command by the Too Fat Lardies. So far in part 1 we covered an introduction to the game, the turn sequence, the command dice and other things. To understand the topics covered in this video, it's worth going back and watching part 1. You'll find it in the how to play list on this channel or in the video description below, along with some other useful links. This part is going to deal with unit activations, leader activations and movements, so let's dive straight in. Before we examine the activations in some detail, we first need to understand the organisation of the forces and what the difference between sections and teams are. Through the rest of this video I will refer to units. This can mean individual teams or groups of teams fighting together as a section, or even a full platoon. If I am talking about a specific element, I will refer to it by its name as either team or section, but the word units is just a cover-all if I am not being specific. Chain of command games are based around the basic platoon. This is usually made up of 3 or 4 sections or squads, each of 8 to 11 men depending on the nationality and other factors in the scenario. I'll use the term section throughout these videos, but it means the same as squad if that's the title that you're more familiar with. Each section is then further broken down, usually into a rifle team and a machine gun team, with the section commanded by a junior leader. So sections are grouped into a platoon, which is usually commanded by a junior officer with a senior NCO. Platoons may also sometimes have separate anti-tank or light mortar teams attached, but this is dependent on the nationality and the date of the force you're fielding. Individual soldiers have to be within 4 inches of another member of the team to be counted as part of that team or section. If a soldier or a group of soldiers are further than this distance, then they are treated as a separate team until a time when they regroup within 4 inches of another team or section. In short, several teams can make up a section, but teams may also be independent and operate independently. However, the smaller the unit, the more fragile it is in combat, so common sense usually dictates that the teams from a section remain together. So now we understand teams, sections and units, we'll turn back to the command dice and activations. I mentioned that a score of between 1 and 4 on the command dice will allow a player to activate 1 or more of their units. A roll of 1 will allow a player to activate a single discrete team. A score of 2 will allow for a section to be activated, and this can include multiple teams. A junior leader will be activated on a 3 and a senior leader will be activated on a 4. These scores can be combined to get a higher result, so 2 2s could be used to make a single 4. However, the results cannot be split, neither can scores be combined to gain a 5 or a 6. Each individual team, section or leader can only be activated once per phase, no matter what the score on the command dice rolls. However, that doesn't stop them being activated multiple times during a turn, which is why it's beneficial to gain control of the next phase by rolling those multiple 6s. When the game begins, generally all the soldiers will be off the table and will need to be deployed before they can join the action. To deploy a unit or leaders, the player will need to be able to activate their units using the command dice roll. They then will use the jumping off points that were previously placed in the patrol phase to bring their units onto the tabletop. The quality of the troops gives the distance from the jumping off point to which they can deploy. Green troops deploy up to 4 inches, veterans will deploy up to 6 inches and elites will deploy up to 9 inches. Units can deploy anywhere as long as it is within that distance, even close to the enemy. It is probably better to use what cover there is available though. Troops that deploy in this phase cannot move, but they can fire at full effect. When deploying, a team such as a light machine gun that is part of a larger section cannot deploy on a 1. The full section will only deploy on rolls of 2. The 1 is reserved for a single discrete weapons team such as a Panzerschreck or a medium or heavy machine gun when they're deploying. When units are already on the table, there's a slight difference in that teams within sections can now be activated on a score of 1, as can a single discrete weapons team. Sections and teams can take 1 action per activation. Activating a unit means it can either move or fire, but we'll look in more detail at movement and firing later in another video. It's important to remember that there is no order in which you can use your dice to activate your units. This rule also includes separate teams within a section. So whilst activating your section on a roll of 2, it may fire with the machine gun weapons team at the enemy and then charge the rest of the riflemen into close assault, using that same activation roll. Phases in Chain of Command, like real life, are fluid and allow a player to react to a changing situation using the command dice to the best effect at that particular moment. Leaders will operate differently to sections and teams when they are activated. There are 2 types of leader, junior and senior. Junior leaders command a specific section or a weapons team and can be activated on a roll of 3. Senior leaders will command men within their bigger battalion formation and activate on a roll of 4. Each leader has a level of command initiative, and this tells us how many actions they have during their activation. Junior leaders have 2, senior leaders have 3, and ranking senior officers will have 4. The leaders can use one of their command initiative to activate a team or section. Remember that a team or section may only activate once per phase, so if a unit is already activated, the leader cannot get them to do anything until either the phase ends or the turn ends. However, leaders also do have actions that are not counted as activations. These actions will not affect a unit's activations, whether it is activated or not in this turn. These actions are rallying shock, throwing grenades, firing a single section anti-tank weapon. So for example, with a roll of 3 and a 2, this leader could rally shock from this section using the 3, and then the unit could fire using the 2 with their reduced level of shock. To activate or influence a unit, the leader generally has to either be attached to the unit physically or within his command radius that is between 6 or 12 inches, depending on his rank. This is how units may activate using the command dice. So let's have a look at some of those actions in a bit more detail, starting with movement. For infantry, there are different types of movement rates, and each one has its own positives and negatives when being used. With tactical movement, the activated unit will move 1d6 worth of inches, and they will be in a tactical stance at the end of that movement. This means they are hugging the terrain, making them harder to hit when fired at. A tactical stance increases a unit's cover by 1, so light cover becomes heavy cover, etc. When using normal movement, the unit may either move 2d6 inches and not fire, or move 1d6 inches and fire. Troops using normal movement can either fire and move in whichever order suits them. The fastest movement rate is on the double, which is 3d6 inches. A unit moving at the double cannot fire and will also suffer disorder, taking a point of shock to reflect this. We will talk more about shock in another video. When a section is ordered to move, the individual teams within that section can move as one on the same dice score, or separately with separate dice rolls for each separate team. This may mean that the teams fall out of the 4-inch cohesion for sections, and will be considered as a separate unit until they reform, if they ever choose to in the future. Terrain will affect how fast a unit or a leader can move, and there are penalties for moving through things like broken ground, woods, heavy undergrowth, etc. The penalty is usually 1 or 2 inches taken off the dice scores. Because of the skirmish scale of the game, model buildings are treated as though they are represented on the table. Troops are only able to enter through doorways and other large openings, and players should agree between themselves on those before the game begins. During a phase, if soldiers move within 4 inches of an opponent's jumping off point, then that point is considered to be captured until the end of that turn. If none of the opponent's units are able to move onto the jumping off point before the end of the turn, then the jumping off point is removed from the game, and that force's morale may well suffer for losing such an important position. So now we know how activations work and how units move across the battlefield. That wraps up part 2. In part 3 we will look in greater detail at how units fire, how they close assault, how support weapons work in the game. But for now, thanks for watching and stay tuned for part 3.